of Saldeia. Lying on his bed in the dark, in his shirt sleeves, Kadir idly twirled one of his large kerchiefs between his hands. The wagon's open windows let in moonlight, but not much breeze. At least Kyrian was cooler than the waste. Someday he hoped to return to Saldeia, to walk in the garden where his sister Theodora had taught him his first letters and numbers. He missed her as much as he did Saldeia, the deep winters when trees burst from their sap freezing, and the only way to travel was by snowshoes or skis. In these southlands, spring felt like summer, and summer like the pit of doom. Sweat rolled out of him in streams. With a heavy sigh, he pushed his fingers into a small gap where the bed was built into the wagon. The folded scrap of parchment rustled. He left it there. He knew the words on it by heart. You are not alone among strangers. A way has been chosen. Just that, without signature, of course. He had found it slipped under his door when he retired for the night. There was a town, not a quarter of a mile away, Ironrod. But even if a soft bed remained empty there, he doubted whether the Aiel would allow him to spend a night away from the wagons, or that the Aes Sedai would. For the moment, his plans fit in well enough with Moraine's. Perhaps he would get to see Tarvalin again. A dangerous place for his sort, but the work there was always important and invigorating. He put his mind back on the note, though he wished he could afford to ignore it. The word chosen made him sure it came from another dark friend. The first surprise had been receiving it now after crossing most of Carian. Nearly 2 months ago, right after Jason Attale attached himself to Randolph Thor, for reasons the man had never deigned to explain, and his new partner, Kali Shaogi, had disappeared, he suspected she was buried in the waste with a thrust from the Tale's knife through her heart and small riddance. Soon after that, he had been visited by one of the chosen, by Lanfear herself. She had given him his instructions. Automatically, his hand went to his chest, feeling through his shirt the scars branded there. He mopped his face with a kerchief. Part of his mind thought coldly, as it had at least once a day since, that they were an effective way to prove to him that it had not been an ordinary dream, an ordinary nightmare. Another part of him almost gibbered with relief that she had not returned. The second surprise of the note had been the hand. A woman's hand, unless he missed his guess by a mile, and some of the letters formed in what he now knew for an Aiel way. Natale had told him that there must be dark friends among the Aiel. There were dark friends in every land, among every people. But he had never wanted to find brothers in the waste. Aiel would kill you as soon as look at you, and you could put a foot wrong with them by breathing. Taken all in all, the note spelled disaster. Possibly Natale had told some Aiel dark friend who he was. Angrily twirling the kerchief to a long, thin cord, he snapped it tight between his hands. If the Gleeman and Kylie had not had proofs that they stood high in dark friend councils, he would have killed them both before going near the waste. The only other possibility made his stomach leaden. A way has been chosen. Maybe that had only been to put the word chosen down, and maybe it was meant to tell him that one of the chosen had decided to use him. The note had not come from Lanfear. She would simply have spoken to him in his dreams once more. In spite of the heat, he shivered. Yet he had to wipe his face again, too. He had the feeling that Lanfear was a jealous mistress to serve. But if another of the chosen wanted him, he would have no choice. Despite all the promises made when he had given his oaths as a boy, he was a man of few illusions. Caught between two of the chosen, he could be flattened like a kitten beneath a wagon wheel, and they would notice as much as the wagon did. He wished he were home in Saldeia. He wished he could see Theodora again. A scraping at the door brought him to his feet. For all his bulk, he was more agile than he let anyone see. Mopping his face and neck, he made his way past the brick stove that he certainly had no need for here, and the cabinets with their ornately carved and painted uprights. When he pulled the door open, a slender figure, swathed in black robes, scurried in past him. He took one quick look around the moonlit darkness to make certain no one was watching, The drivers were all snoring beneath the other wagons, and the ideal guards never came among the wagons themselves. I quickly shut the door again. You must be hot, Cassandra, he chuckled. Take off that robe and make yourself comfortable. Thank you, no, she said bitterly from the shadowed depths of her cowl. She stood stiffly, but every now and then she twitched. The wool must be even itchier than usual tonight. He chuckled again. As you wish. Beneath those robes, he suspected, the maidens of the spear still allowed her to wear nothing but the stolen jewelry, if that. She had become prudish in ways since the maidens had her. Why the woman had been stupid enough to steal, he could not understand. He had certainly made no objections when they dragged her screaming from the wagon by her hair. He was only glad that they had not thought he was involved. Her greediness had certainly made his task more difficult. Have you anything to report on Althor and her tale? A major part of Lanfear's instruction had been to keep a close eye on those two, and he knew no better way to keep an eye on a man than to put a woman in his bed. Any man told his bedmate things he had vowed to keep secret, boasted of his plans, revealed his weaknesses, even if he was the dragon reborn, and this Dawn fellow of the ideal called him. She shuddered visibly. At least I can come near Natail. Come near him? Once the maidens had caught her sneaking to the man's tent, they had practically begun stuffing her into it every night. She always put the best face on matters. Not that he tells me anything. Wait, be patient, keep silent, make accommodation with fate. He says that every time I try to ask a question. For the most part, all he wants to do is play music I've never heard before and make love. She never had anything more to say about the Gleeman. For the 100th time, he wondered why Lanfear wanted Natail watched. The man was supposed to be as high as a dark friend could reach, only a step below the Chosen themselves. I take it that means you still have not managed to wriggle into Althor's bed? He asked, brushing past her to sit down on the bed. No. She writhed uncomfortably. Then you will have to try harder, won't you? I am growing tired of failure, Isendra, and our masters are not as patient as I. He's only a man, whatever his titles. She had often boasted to him that she could have any man she wanted and make him do whatever she wanted. She had shown him the truth of her boasts. She had not needed to steal jewelry. He would have bought her anything she wanted. He had bought her more than he could afford. The bloody maidens can't watch him every second. And once you are in his bed, he'll not let them harm you. One taste of her would be enough for that. I have full faith and confidence in your abilities. No. If anything, the word was shorter this time. He rolled and unrolled the kerchief irritably. No is not a word our masters like to hear, Isendra. That meant their lords among the Dark Friends. Not all lords or ladies by any means. A groom might give orders to a lady, a beggar to a magistrate. But their commands were as strictly enforced as any noble's, and usually more so. Not a word our mistress will like to hear. Isendra shuddered. She had not believed his tale until he showed her the burns on his chest, but since then, one mention of Lanfear had been enough to quell any rebellion on her part. This time she began to weep. I cannot have none. When we stopped tonight, I thought I might have a chance in a town instead of tents, but they caught me before I got within 10 paces of him. She pushed back her hood, and he gaped as moonlight played over her bare scalp. Even her eyebrows were black. They shaved me, Hadnan, Adeline and Anila and Jolene. They held me down and shaved every hair. They beat me with nettles, Hadnan. She shook like a sapling in high wind, sobbing slack-mouthed and mumbling the words. I hit you from shoulders to knees, and I burned too much to scratch. They said they'd make me wear nettles the next time I so much as looked in his direction. They meant it, Hadnan. They did. They said they'd give me to Avienda, and they told me what she would do. I cannot, Hadnan. Not again. I cannot. Stunned, he stared at her. She had had such lovely dark hair. Yet she was beautiful enough that even being bald as an egg only made her seem exotic. Her tears and sagging face detracted only a little. If she could put herself into Althor's bed for just one night. It was not going to happen. The maidens had broken her. He had broken people himself, and he knew the signs. Eagerness to avoid more punishments became eagerness to obey. The mind never wanted to admit it was running from something, so she would soon convince herself that she really wanted to obey, that she really wanted nothing more than to please the maidens. What does Avienda have to do with it? He muttered. How soon before Essendra felt the need to confess her sins as well. Althor has been betting her since Viridion, you fool! She spends every night with him. The maidens think she will marry him. Even through her sobs, he could detect resentful fury. She would not like it that another had succeeded where she failed. Doubtless that was why she had not told him before.
Excuse me.
Avienda was a beautiful woman, despite her fierce eyes, full-breasted compared to most of the maidens. Yet he would stack Essendra against her, if only... Essendra slumped in the moonlight coming through the windows, quivering from head to toe, sobbing open-mouthed, tears rolling down her cheeks that she did not even bother to wipe away.
Hey, D-Man, how you doing, bro?
She would grovel on the ground if Avienda frowned at her.
Hope you're doing well.
Very well, he said gently. If you cannot, then you cannot. You can still pry something out of Natail. I know you can. Rising, he took her shoulders to jump toward the door. She flinched away from his touch, but she did turn. Natail will not want to look at me for days, she said petulantly around hiccups and sniffs. Sobs threatened to break out again any moment, but his tone seemed to have soothed her. I'm red, Hadnan. As red as if I had laid naked in the sun for a day.
Oh,
And
shit.
my hair,
Hell yeah,
it
D-Man.
would take forever to
Appreciate
grow
it.
back.
Hell yeah.
As she reached for the door, her eyes
Definitely
going to the
glad.
handle,
Congratulations on
and
your
the
new
kerchief strung
job,
to the
bro.
cord in an instant and around her neck. He tried to ignore her
What,
rasping
5 p.m.?
gurgles, the
Damn.
frantic scraping of her feet on the floor. Her fingers clawed at his hands, but he stared straight ahead.
Yeah, I start my
Even keeping his eyes open, he saw Theodora.
100-centimeter one
He
tomorrow.
always did when he killed a woman. He had loved his sister, but she had discovered what he was,
Hell yeah, D-Man.
and she would not have kept silent. Essendra's heels drummed violently, but after what seemed an eternity, they slowed, went still,
It's
and
training.
she became a dead weight dragging at his hands. He held the cord tight for a count of 60 before unwinding it and letting her fall. She would have been confessing next, confessing to being a dark friend, pointing a finger at him. Rummaging in the cabinets by touch, he pulled out a butchering knife. Disposing of a whole corpse would be difficult, but luckily the dead did not bleed much. The robe would absorb what little there was. Maybe he could find the woman who had left the note under his door. If she was not pretty enough, she must have friends who were also dark friends. Natail would not care if it was an Aiel woman who visited him. Kadir would rather have betted a viper himself. Aiel were dangerous. And maybe an Aiel would have a better chance than Essendra against
What's your
Avienda.
new job gonna be, D-Man?
Kneeling, he hummed quietly to himself as he worked, a lullaby that Theodora had taught to him. Chapter 30. A Wager. A soft night breeze stirred across the small town of Ironrod, then faded. Sitting on the stone rail of the wide flat bridge in the heart of the town, Rand supposed the breeze was hot, yet it hardly felt so after the waste. Warm for nighttime, perhaps, but not enough to make him unbutton his red coat. The river below him had never been large, and was half its normal width now, yet he still enjoyed watching the water flow north, moon shadows cast by scudding clouds playing across the darkly glittering surface. That was why he was out here in the night, really, to look at running water for a time. His wards were set, surrounding the Aiel encampment that itself surrounded the town. The Aiel themselves kept a watch a sparrow could not pierce unseen. He could waste an hour being soothed by the flow of a river. It was surely better than another night where he had to order Moraine to leave so he could study with Osmodian. She had even taken to bringing his meals to him and talking while he ate, as if she meant to cram everything she knew into his head before they reached the city of Cairhien. He could not face her begging to remain, actually begging, as she had the previous night. For a woman like Moraine, that behavior was so unnatural that he had wanted to agree simply to stop it, which was very likely why she had done it. Much better an hour listening to the quiet, liquid ripplings of the river. With luck, she would have given up on him for tonight. The 8 or 10 paces of clay between water and weeds on both sides below him was dried and cracked. He peered up at the clouds, crossing the moon. He could try to make those clouds give rain. The town's 2 fountains were both dry, and dust lay in a third of the wells not fouled beyond cleaning. Try was the word, though. He had made it rain once. Remembering how was the trick. If he managed that, then he could try not to make it a drowning deluge and a tree-snapping windstorm this time. Osmodian would be no help. He did not know much about weather, it seemed. For everything the man taught him, there were 2 more that made Osmodian either throw up his hands or give a lick and a promise. Once he had thought that the Forsaken knew everything, that they were all but omnipotent. But if the others were like Osmodian, they had ignorances as well as weaknesses. It might actually be that he already knew more of some things than they. Than some of them, at least. The problem would be finding out who. Semirog was almost as poor at handling weather as Osmodian. He shivered as if this were night in the Threefold Land. Osmodian had never told him that. Better to listen to the water and not think, if he meant to sleep at all tonight. Sulin approached him, the shufa around her shoulders so it uncovered her short white hair, and leaned on the railing. The wiry maiden was armed for battle, bow and arrows, spears and knife and buckler. She had taken command of his bodyguard tonight. 24 more, Farder Eyes Mai, squatted easily on the bridge 10 paces away. An odd night, she said. We were gambling, but suddenly everyone was throwing nothing but 6s. I'm sorry, he told her without thinking, and she gave him a peculiar look. She did not know, of course. He had not spread it about. The ripples he gave off as Taviran spread out in odd, random ways. Even the Aiel would not want to be within 10 miles of him if they knew. The ground had given way beneath 3 stone dogs today, dropping them into a viper pit, but none of the dozens of bites had found anything but cloth. He knew that had been him, bending chance. Talnethan, the saddle-maker, had survived Tyan to trip on a stone this very noon and break his neck, falling on flat, grassy ground. Rand was afraid that had been him, too. On the other hand, Bale and Geron had mended the blood feud between the Sharad and the Goshin, while he was with them, eating a midday meal of dried meat on the move. They still did not like each other, and hardly seemed to understand what they had done, but it was done, with pledges and water oaths given, each man holding the cup for the other to drink. To Aiel, water oaths were stronger than any other. It might be generations before Sharad and Goshin so much as raided each other for sheep or goats or cattle. He had wondered if those random effects would ever work in his favor. Maybe this was as close as it came. What else had happened today that might be laid at his feet, he did not know. He never asked, and would as soon not hear. The Bales and Gerons could only partly make up for the Talnethans. I've not seen Anila or Adeline for days, he said. It was as good a change of subject as any. That pair in particular had seemed to be jealous of their places guarding him. Are they ill? If anything, the look Sulin gave him was even more peculiar. They will return when they learn to stop playing with dolls, Randolph Thor. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Aiel were strange. Avi and his lessons often made them more so, not less. But this was ridiculous. Well, tell them they are grown women, and they ought to act it. Even by moonlight, he could tell that her smile was pleased. It shall be as the Khan wishes. What did that mean? She eyed him a moment, lips pursed thoughtfully. You have not eaten yet tonight. There is still enough food for everyone. And you will not fill one belly by going hungry yourself. If you do not eat, people will worry that you are ill. You will become ill. He laughed softly, a hoarse wheeze. The Khan 1 minute, and the next. If he did not fetch something to eat, Sulin would probably go get it for him, and try to feed him to boot. I will eat. Moraine must be in her blankets by now. This time, her odd look was satisfying. For a change, he had said something that she did not understand. As he swung his feet down, he heard the ring of horses' hooves walking down the stone-paved street toward the bridge. Every maiden was upright in an instant, face veiled, half-knocked arrows. His hand went to his waist by instinct, but the sword was not there. The Aiel felt strange enough about him riding a horse and carrying the thing at his saddle. He had not seen any need to offend their customs more by wearing it. Besides, there were not many horses, and they were coming at a walk. When they appeared, surrounded by an escort of 50 Aiel, the riders numbered fewer than 20, slumping in their saddles dejectedly. Most wore rimmed helmets and Tyran coats with puffy striped sleeves beneath their breastplates. The pair in the lead had ornately gilded cuirasses and large white plumes attached to the front of their helmets, and the stripes on their sleeves had the glisten of satin in the moonlight. Half a dozen men at the rear, though shorter and slighter than the Tyrans, two with small banners called Khan on short staffs harnessed to their backs, wore dark coats and helmets shaped like bells cut away to expose their faces. Karianen used the banners to pick out officers in battle, and also to mark a lord's personal retainers. The Tyrans with plumes stared when they saw him, exchanged startled glances, then scrambled down to come kneel before him, helmets under their arms. They were young, little older than he, both with dark beards trimmed to neat points in the fashion of Tyran nobility. Dents marred their breastplates, and the gilding was chipped. They had been crossing swords somewhere. Neither as much as glanced at the Aiel surrounding them, as if when ignored they would disappear. The maidens unveiled, though they looked no less ready to put a spear or arrow through the kneeling men. Ruark followed the Tyrans, with a gray-eyed Aiel younger and slightly taller than he, and stood behind. Mangin was of the Jindo Tardad, and one of those who had gone to the Stone of Tyr. Jindo had brought in the riders. "My Lord Dragon," the plump, pink-cheeked lordling said. "Burn my soul, but have they taken you prisoner?" His companion, Jug Ears and Potato Nose, making him look like a farmer despite his beard, kept sweeping lanky hair from his forehead nervously. "They said they were taking us to some Dawn fellow. The Khan means something about chiefs, if I remember what my tutor said. Forgive me, my Lord Dragon. I am a Dorian of House Salona, and this is Estian of House Andiama." "I am he who comes with the dawn," Bran told them quietly, "and the Khan." He had them placed now, young lords who had spent their time drinking, gambling, and chasing women when he was in the stone. Estian's eyes nearly popped out of his face. Dorian looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he suddenly saw how it made sense. "Stand. Who are your Karianen companions?" It would be interesting to meet Karianen, who were not running for their lives from the Shido, and any other Aiel they saw. For that matter, if they were with Dorian and Estian, they might be the first supporters he had met in this land. If the two Tyrants' fathers had followed his orders. "Bring them forward." Estian blinked in surprise as he rose, but Dorian barely paused in turning to shout, "Mirasin! Darakain! Come here!" Much like calling dogs. The Carienans' banners bobbed as they dismounted slowly. "My Lord Dragon," Estienne hesitated, licking his lips as though thirsty. Did you send the Aiel against Carien?" "They've attacked the city, then?" Ruark nodded, and Mangan said, "If these are to be believed, Carien still holds, or did 3 days ago." There was little doubt that he did not think it still did, and less that he cared about a city of tree killers. "I did not send them, Estienne," Rand said, as they were joined by the 2 Carienan, who knelt, doffing their helmets to reveal men of an age with the Dorian and Estienne, their hair shaved back in line with their ears, and their dark eyes wary. "Those who attack the city are my enemies, the Shaido. I mean to save Carien, if it can be saved." He had to go through the business of telling the Carienan to rise. His time with the Aiel had almost made him forget the habit this side of the spine of the world, bowing and kneeling right and left. He had to ask for introductions, too, and the Carienan gave them themselves. Lieutenant Lord Mirison of House Dagonred. His con was all wavy vertical lines of red and white. And Lieutenant Lord Daracane of House Annalyn. His con covered with small squares of red and black. It was a surprise that they were lords. Though lords commanded and led soldiers in Carien, they did not shave their heads and become soldiers. Or had not. Much had changed, apparently. "My Lord Dragon," Mirison stumbled a bit saying that. He and Daracane were both pale, slender men, with narrow faces and long noses, but he was a bit the heavier. Neither looked as if he had had much to eat lately. Mirison rushed on as if afraid of being interrupted. "My Lord Dragon, Carien can hold, for days yet, perhaps as many as 10 or 12. But you must come quickly if you are to save it." "That is why we came out," Estienne said, shooting Mirison a dark look. Both Carienan returned it, but their defiance was tinged with resignation. Estienne raked stringy hair from his forehead. "To find help. Parties have been sent in every direction, my Lord Dragon." He shivered despite the sweat on his brow, and his voice turned distant and hollow. "There were more of us when we started. I saw Barin go down, screaming with a spear through his guts. He'll never turn a card or chop again. I could use a mug of strong brandy." Dorian turned his helmet and gauntleted hands, frowning. "My Lord Dragon, the city can hold a while longer, but even if these Aiel will fight those, the question is, can you bring them there in time? I think 10 or 12 days is a more than generous estimate myself. In truth, I only came because I thought dying with a spear through me would be better than being taken alive when they made it over the walls. The city is packed with refugees who fled ahead of the Aiel. There isn't a dog or a pigeon left in the city, and I doubt there will be a rat left soon. The one good thing is that no one seems to be worrying very much about who will take the Sun Throne, not with this Couladin outside. He called on us to surrender to he who comes with the dawn on the second day," Daracane put in, earning a sharp look from Dorian for the interruption. "Couladin has some sport with prisoners," Estienne said. "Out of bowshot, but where anyone on the walls can see. You can hear them screaming, too. The light burned my soul. I don't know whether he is trying to break our will, or simply likes it. Sometimes they let peasants make a run for the city, then shoot them full of arrows when they're almost safe. However safe Carien is. Only peasants, but..." His voice trailed off and swallowed hard, as if he had just remembered what Rand's opinions were of only peasants. Rand just looked at him, but he seemed to shrivel, and muttered under his breath about brandy. Dorian leaped into the momentary silence. "My Lord Dragon, the point is that the city can hold until you come, if you can come quickly. We only beat back the first assault before the foregate caught fire. Flames nearly took the city," Estienne interjected. The foregate, a city in itself outside the walls of Carien, had been mostly wood, as Rand remembered. Would have been disaster if the river was not right there. The other tyrant went on right over him. But Lord Mylan has the defense well planned, and the Carian appear to be keeping their backbones for the time. That earned him frowns from Miracin and Daracane that he either did not see or pretended not to. 7 days with luck, perhaps 8 at the most. If you can... A heavy sigh abruptly seemed to deflate Adorian's plumpness. I did not see one horse, he said as if to himself. The Aiel do not ride. You will never be able to move men afoot so far in time. How long? Grand asked Ruark. 7 days, was the reply. Magnan nodded, and Estion laughed. Burn my soul! It took us as long to reach here on horses. If you think you can make the return in the same afoot, you must be... Becoming aware of the Aiel eyes on him, Estion scrubbed the hair from his face. Is there any brandy in this town? He muttered. It isn't how fast we can make it, Rand said quietly, but how fast you can. If you dismount some of your men and use their horses for spares. I want to let Mylon and Carian know that help is on the way. But whoever goes will have to be sure he can keep his mouth shut if the Shido take him. I do not intend to let Fulden know any more than he can learn on his own. Estion went whiter in the face than the Carianan. Miracin and Daracane were on their knees together, each seizing one of Rand's hands to kiss. He let them, with as much patience as he could find. One bit of Moraine's advice, that had the ring of common sense, was not to offend people's customs, however strange or even repulsive, unless you absolutely had to, and even then, think twice. We will go, my Lord Dragon, Miracin said breathlessly. Thank you, my Lord Dragon, thank you. Under the light, I vow I will die before revealing a word to any but my father or the High Lord Mylan. Grace favor you, my Lord Dragon, the other added. Grace favor you, and the light illumine you forever. I am your man to the death. Rand let Miracin say that he was also Rand's man before taking his hands back firmly and telling them to stand. He did not like the way they were looking at him. Dorian had called them like hounds, but men should not look at anyone as if they were dogs gazing at a master. Dorian drew a deep breath, puffing his pink cheeks, and let it out slowly. I suppose if I made it out in one piece, I can make it back in. My Lord Dragon, forgive me if I offend, but would you care to wager, say, 1,000 gold crowns that you can really come in 7 days? Rand stared at him. The man was as bad as Matt. I don't have 100 crowns silver, much less 1,000 in... Sulin broke in. He has it, Tyron, she said firmly. He will meet your wager, if you make it 10,000 by weight. Dorian laughed. Done, I yield. And worth every copper if I lose. Come to think, I'll not live to collect if I win. Come, Miracin, Daracane. It sounded as if he were summoning dogs to heel. We ride. Rand waited until the three had made their bows and were halfway back to the horses before rounding on the white-haired maiden. What do you mean I have 1,000 gold crowns? I've never seen 1,000 crowns, much less 10,000. The maidens exchanged glances as if he were demented. So did Ruark and Mangan. 1/5 of the treasure that was in the Stone of Tyr belongs to those who took the stone, and will be claimed when they can carry it away. Sulin spoke as to a child, instructing it in the simple facts of everyday life. As chief and battle leader there, 1/10 of that 1/5 is yours. Tyr submitted to you as chief by right of triumph, so 1/10 of Tyr is yours as well. And you have said we can take the 5th in these lands. Tax, you called it. She fumbled the word. The Aiel did not have taxes. The 10th part of that is yours also, as Ka'akan. Rand shook his head. In all of his talks with Avienda, he had never thought to ask whether the 5th applied to him. He was not Aiel, Ka'akan or no. and it had not seemed anything to do with him. Well, it might not be a tax, but he could use it as kings did taxes. Unfortunately, he had only the vaguest idea how that was. He would have to ask Moraine. That was one thing she had missed in her lectures. Perhaps she thought it was so obvious that he should know. Elaine would have known what taxes were used for. It had certainly been more fun taking advice from her than from Moraine. He wished he knew where she was. Still in Tonchico, probably. Egwene told him little more than a constant string of well-wishings. He wished he could sit Elaine down and make her explain those 2 letters. Maiden of the Spear or daughter heir of Andor. Women were strange. Except maybe me. She had laughed at him, but she had never made him think she was speaking some strange language. She would not laugh now. If he ever saw her again, she would run 100 miles to get away from the Dragon Reborn. The Dorian dismounted all his men, taking one of their horses and stringing the others together by their reins, along with Estion's. No doubt he was saving his own for the final sprint through the Shido. Mirasin and Darakain did the same with their men. Though it meant that the Carrienan had only 2 spare mounts apiece, no one seemed to think they should have any of the Tyrant horses. They clattered off together westward at a trot, with a Jindo escort. Carefully not looking at anyone, Estion started to drift toward the soldiers standing uneasily in a circle of Aiel at the foot of the bridge. Mangan caught his red-striped sleeve. "You can tell us conditions inside Carrion, Wetlander." The lumpy-faced man looked ready to faint. "I am certain he will answer any questions you ask," Rand said sharply, emphasizing the final word. "They will only be asked," Ruark said, taking the tyrant's other arm. He and Mangan seemed to be holding the much shorter man up between them. "Warning the city's defenders is well and good, Randolthor," Ruark went on. "But we should send scouts. Running, they can reach Kyrian as soon as those men on horses, and meet us coming back with word how Couladin has disposed the Shido." Rand could feel the maiden's eyes on him, but he looked straight at Ruark. "Thunderwalkers," he suggested. "Shamad Kunda," Ruark agreed. He and Mangan turned Estion. They were holding him up, and started toward the other soldiers. "Ask," Rand called after them. "He is your ally, and my liegeman." He had no idea whether Estion was that last or not. It was another thing to ask Moraine. Or even how much of an ally he really was. His father, the High Lord Torion, had plotted against Rand enough, but he would allow nothing close to Couladin's ways. Ruark turned his head and nodded. "You tend your people well, Randall Thor." Sulan's voice was flat as a plain plank. "I try," he told her. He was not about to rise to the bait. Whoever went to scout the Shido, some would not return, and that was that. "I think I will have something to eat now and get some sleep." It could not be much more than 2 hours to midnight, and sunrise still came early this time of year. The maidens followed him, watching the shadows warily as if they expected attack, and talk flickering among them. But then, Aiel always seemed to expect attack. Chapter 31. The Far Snows. The streets of Ironrod ran straight and met at right angles, where necessary slicing through hills that were otherwise neatly terraced with stone. The slate-roofed stone buildings had an angular look, as if they were all vertical lines. Ironrod had not fallen to Couladin. No people had been there when the Shido swept through. A good many of the houses were only charred beams and hollow, ruined shells, however, including most of the wide 3-story marble buildings with balconies that Moraine had said belonged to merchants. Broken furniture and clothes littered the streets, along with shattered dishes and shards of glass from windows, single boots and tools and toys. The burning had come at different times. Rand could tell that much himself, from the weathering of blackened timbers and how much smell of char lingered where. But Lan had been able to chart the flow of battles, by which the town had been taken and retaken. By different houses contending for the Sun Throne, most likely, though from the look of the streets, the last to hold iron rod had been brigands. A good many of the bands roaming Carrion held allegiance to no one and to nothing except gold. It was to one of the merchants' houses that Rand went, on the largest of the town's 2 squares, 3 square stories of gray marble with heavy balconies and wide steps with thick angular stone side rails, overlooking a silent fountain with a dusty round basin. A chance to sleep in a bed again had been too good to pass up, and he had hopes that Avienda would choose to remain in a tent. Whether his or with the wise ones, he did not care, so long as he did not have to try going to sleep while listening to her breathe a few paces away. Recently, he had begun imagining he could hear her heartbeat, even when he had not taken hold of Saidin. But if she did not stay away, he had taken precautions. The maidens stopped at the steps, some trotting around the building to take positions on all sides. He had feared that they would try declaring this a roof of the maidens, even for one night. And so as soon as he had chosen the building, one of the few in town with a sound roof and most of the windows unbroken, he had told Sulin that he was declaring it the roof of the Winespring brothers. No one could enter who had not drunk from the wine spring in Emmons Field. From the look she had given him, she knew very well what he was up to, but none of them followed him beyond the wide doors that seemed to be all narrow vertical panels. Inside, the large rooms were bare, though white-robed Guy Shine had spread a few blankets for themselves in the broad entry hall. Its high plaster ceiling worked in a pattern of severe squares. Keeping Guy Shine out was beyond him, even had he wanted to, as much so as keeping Moraine out if she was not asleep elsewhere. Whatever orders he gave about not being disturbed, she always found a way to make the maidens let her by, and it always took a direct command for her to go before she would leave. The Guy Shine rose smoothly, men and women, before he had the door closed. They would not sleep until he did, and some would take turns remaining awake in case he wanted something in the night. He had tried ordering them not to, but telling a Guy Shine not to serve according to custom was like kicking a bale of wool. Whatever impression you made was gone as soon as your toes were. He waved them away and climbed the marble stairs. Some of those Guy Shine had salvaged a few bits of furniture, including a bed and 2 feather mattresses, and he was looking forward to washing, and he froze as soon as he opened the door to his bedchamber. Avienda had not chosen to remain with the tents. She stood before the washstand with its mismatched cracked bowl and pitcher, a cloth in one hand and a bar of yellow soap in the other. She had no clothes on. She seemed as stunned as he, as incapable of moving. She stopped to swallow, big green eyes locked on his face. I could not make a sweat tent here in this town, so I thought I would try your way of... She was hard muscle and soft curves. She glistened damply from head to feet. He had never imagined that her legs were so long. I thought you would remain longer at the bridge. Her voice rose in pitch, her eyes widened in panic. I did not arrange for you to see me. I must get away from you, as far away as I can. I must. Suddenly, a shimmering vertical line appeared in the air near her. It widened as if rotating into a gateway. Icy wind rushed through it into the room, carrying thick curtains of snow. I must get away, she wailed, and darted through into the blizzard. Immediately, the gateway began to narrow again, turning. But without thought, Rand channeled, blocking it at half its former width. He did not know what he had done or how, but he was sure this was a gateway for traveling, such as Asmodean had told him of, and been unable to teach him. There was no time for thinking. Wherever Avienda had gone, she had gone naked into the heart of a winter storm. Rand tied off the floes he had woven as he ripped all the blankets from the bed and tossed them onto her clothes and pallet. Seizing blankets, clothes, and rugs all together, he plunged through, only moments behind her. Icy wind screamed through night air filled with swirling white. Even wrapped in the void, he could feel his body shivering. Dimly, he could make out scattered shapes in the darkness. Trees, he thought. There was nothing for him to smell but cold. Ahead of him, a form moved, obscured by darkness and the snowstorm. He might have missed it, but for the sharpness of his eyes in the void. Avienda, running as hard as she could. He lumbered after her through snow to his knees, clutching the thick bundle to his chest. Avienda, stop! He was afraid that the howling wind would sweep his shout away, but she heard, and if anything, ran faster. He forced himself to more speed, staggering and tripping as the deepening snow tugged at his boots. The prints left by her bare feet were filling fast. If he lost sight of her in this... Stop, you fool woman! Are you trying to kill yourself? The sound of his voice seemed to flog her to run harder. Grimly, he pushed himself, half falling and scrambling back up, knocked down by the hurtling wind, as often as stumbling in the snow, blundering into trees. He had to keep his eyes on her. He was only thankful this forest, or whatever it was, had trees so far apart. Plans skittered across the void and were discarded. He could try quelling the storm, and maybe the result would be to turn the air to ice. A shelter of air to keep the falling snow away would do nothing for that underfoot. He could melt a path for himself with fire, and slog through mud instead. Unless... He channeled, and the snow ahead of him melted in a band a span wide, a band that ran ahead of him as he did. Steam rose, and falling snow vanished a foot above the sandy soil. He could feel the heat of it through his boots. Down almost to his ankles, his body shook with the bone-chilling cold. His feet sweated and flinched away from the heated ground. But he was catching up now. Another 5 minutes, and... Suddenly the vague shape he had been following vanished, as if she had fallen into a hole. Keeping his eyes fixed on the spot where he had last seen her, he ran as hard as he could. Abruptly, he was splashing in icy flowing water to his ankles, halfway to his knees. Ahead of him, the melting snow revealed more, and an edge of ice inching slowly back. No steam rose from the black water. Stream or river, it was too big for the amount of his channeling to warm the swift-moving flow even a hair. She must have run out onto the ice and fallen through. But he would not save her by trying to wade into this. Filled with sardine, he was barely aware of the cold, but his teeth chattered uncontrollably. Retreating to the bank, gaze locked on where he thought Avienda had gone down, he channeled flows of fire into the ground still bare, well back from the stream, until the sand melted and fused and glowed white. Even in this storm, that would stay hot for a time. He set the bundle down in the snow beside it. Her life would depend on finding the blankets and rugs again. Then waded through the deep white to one side of the melted path and lay flat. Slowly, he crawled out onto the snow-covered ice. The wind shrieked across him. His coat might as well not have existed. His hands were numb now, and his feet going. He had stopped shivering except for an occasional shudder. Coldly calm inside the void, he knew what was happening. There were blizzards in the two rivers, perhaps even as bad as this. His body was being overwhelmed. If he did not find warmth soon, he would be able to calmly watch from the void as he died. But if he died, Avienda would too, if she had not already. He felt rather than heard the ice.
1 second, everyone.
His probing hands fell into water. This was the place, but with snow whirling about, he could barely see. He flailed, searching, numb hands splashing. One hit something at the edge of the ice, and he commanded his fingers to close, felt frozen hair crackling. Got to pull her out. He crawled backward, falling at her. She was a dead weight, sliding slowly out of the water. Don't care if the ice scrapes her. Better that than freezing or drowning. Back. Keep moving. If you quit, she dies. Keep moving, burn you. Crawling, pulling with his legs, pushing with one hand. The other locked in Avienda's hair. No time to get a better grip. She could not feel it anyway. You've had it easy for too long. Lord's kneeling and Guy Shine running to fetch your wine, and Moraine doing as she's told. Back. Time to do something yourself if you still can. Move, you flaming fatherless son of a spavined goat. Keep moving. Suddenly, his feet hurt. The pain began creeping up his legs. It took him a moment to look back, and then he rolled off the steaming patch of melted sand. Tendrils of smoke, where his breeches had begun smoldering, were whisked away by the wind. Fumbling for the bundle he had left, he swathed Avienda from head to foot and all of it, the blankets, the rugs of her pallet, her clothes. Every bit of protection was vital. Her eyes were closed, and she did not move. He parted the blankets enough to put an ear to her chest. Her heart beat so slowly that he was not sure he was really hearing it. Even 4 blankets and half a dozen rugs were not enough, and he could not channel heat into her as he had the ground. Even finding the flow as much as possible, he was more likely to kill than warm. He could feel the weave he had used to block open her gateway, a mile or perhaps 2 away through the storm. If he tried to carry her that far, neither of them would survive. They needed shelter, and they needed it here. He channeled flows of air, and snow began to move across the ground against the wind, building into thick, square walls 3 paces on a side, with 1 gap for a door, building higher, compacting the snow till it glistened like ice, roofing it over high enough to stand. Scooping Avienda into his arms, he stumbled into the dark interior, weaving and tying flames dancing in the corners for light, channeling to scoop more snow to close the doorway. Just with the wind shut away, it felt warmer, but that would not be enough. Using the trick Osmodian had shown him, he wove air and fire, and the air around them grew warmer. He did not dare tie that weave off. If he fell asleep, it would grow and melt the hut. For that matter, the flames were almost as dangerous to leave, but he was too bone-weary and chilled to maintain more than 1 weave. The ground inside had been cleared as he built, bare sandy soil with only a few brown leaves he did not recognize, and some scruffy, low, dead weeds that were equally strange to him. Releasing the weave that warmed the air, he heated the ground enough to take away the iciness, then took up the other weave again. It was all he could do to lay Avienda down gently, rather than drop her. He pushed a hand inside the blankets to feel her cheek, her shoulder. Trickles of water ran across her face as her hair melted. He was cold, but she was ice. She needed every scrap of warmth he could find for her, and he did not dare warm the air more. Already the insides of the walls shone with a faint layer of melt. However frozen he felt, he had more heat in him than she did. Stripping off his clothes, he climbed into the coverings with her, arranging his own damp garments on the outside. They could help hold in the body heat. His sense of touch, enhanced by the void and sardine, soaked in the feel of her. Her skin made silk feel rough. Compared to her skin, satin was... Don't think. He smoothed damp hair away from her face. He should have dried it, but the water no longer felt so cold, and there was nothing but the blankets or their clothes to use anyway. Her eyes were closed. Her chest stirred against him slowly. Her head lay on his arm, snuggled against his chest. If she had not felt like winter itself, she could have been sleeping. So peaceful, not angry at all. So beautiful. Stop thinking. It was a sharp command outside the emptiness surrounding him. Talk. He tried talking of the first thing that came to mind. Elaine, and the confusion her 2 letters brought. But that soon had thoughts of golden-haired Elaine drifting across the void, of kissing her in secluded spots in the stone. Don't think of kissing, fool. He shifted to Min. He had never thought about Min that way. Well, a few dreams could not count. Min would have slapped his face if he ever tried to kiss her, or else laughed and called him a woolhead. Only it seemed that speaking of any woman reminded him that he had his arms around a woman who had no clothes on. Filled with the power, he could smell the scent of her, feel every inch of her as clearly as if he were running his hands. The void trembled. Light, you're only trying to warm her. Keep your mind out of the pigsty, man. Trying to drive thought away, he talked of his hopes for Kyrian, to bring peace and an end to the famine, to bring the nations behind him without any more bloodshed. But that had its own life, too, its own inevitable path to Sheol Ghul, where he must face the Dark One and die, if the prophecies were true. It seemed cowardly to say that he hoped he might live through that somehow. Aiel did not know cowardice. The worst of them was brave as a lion. The breaking of the world killed the weak, he had heard Baal say. Of the threefold land killed the cowards. He began speaking of where they might be, where she had brought them with her wild, senseless flight. Somewhere far and strange to have snow at this time of year. It had been worse than a senseless flight. Mad. Yet he knew that she had fled from him. Fled from him. How she must hate him. She had to flee as far as she could, rather than just tell him to leave her to her bath in privacy. I should have knocked at his own bedroom door. I know you do not want to be around me. You don't have to be. Whatever the wise ones want, whatever they say, you are going back to their tents. You will not have to come near me again. In fact, if you do, I'll send you away. Why hesitate on that? She gave him anger, coldness, bitterness when she was awake and asleep. It was a crazy thing to do. You could have killed yourself. He was stroking her hair again. He could not seem to stop. If you ever do anything half so crazy again, I'll break your neck. Do you have any idea how I will miss hearing you breathe at night? Miss it? She drove him crazy with it. He was the one who was mad. He had to stop this. You are going away, and that's that. If I have to send you back to Rodion. The wise ones can't stop me if I speak as Ka'akarn. You won't have to run away from me again. The hand that he could not stop from stroking her hair froze as she stirred. She was warm, he realized. Very warm. He should be wrapping one of the blankets about himself decently and moving away. Her eyes opened, clear and deep green, staring at him seriously from not a foot away. She did not seem surprised to see him, and she did not pull back. He took his arms from around her, started to slither away, and she seized a handful of his hair in a painful grip. If he moved, he would have a bald patch. She gave him no chance to explain anything. I promised my near sister to watch you. She seemed to be speaking to herself as much to him, in a low, almost expressionless voice. I ran from you as hard as I could to shield my honor, and you have followed me even here. The rings do not lie, and I can run no more. Her tone firmed decisively. I will run no more. Rand tried to ask her what she meant while attempting to untangle her fingers from his hair, but she clutched another handful on the other side and pulled her close to hers. That was the end of rational thought. The void shattered and Saidin fled. He did not think he could have stopped himself, and he wanted to. Only he could not think of wanting to, and she certainly did not seem to want him to. In fact, the last thought he had of any coherency for a very long time was that he did not think he could have stopped her. Some considerable time later, 2 hours, maybe 3, he could hardly be sure, he lay atop the rugs with the blankets over him and his hands behind his head, watching Avienda examine the slick white walls. They had held a surprising amount of the warmth. There was no need to latch onto Saidin again, either to shut out cold or to try warming the air. She had done no more than rake her fingers through her hair on rising, and she moved completely unashamed at her nakedness. Of course, it was a bit late to be ashamed of something as small as having no clothes on. He had been worried about hurting her when dragging her out of the water, but she showed fewer scrapes than he did, and somehow they did not seem to mar her beauty at all. What is this? She asked. Snow. He explained what snow was as best he could, but she only shook her head, partly in wonderment, partly in disbelief. For someone who had grown up in the waste, falling from the sky must seem as impossible as flying. According to the records, the only time it had ever even rained in the waste was the time he had made it. He could not stop a sigh of regret when she began pulling her shift over her head. The wise ones can marry us as soon as we get back. He could still feel his weave holding her gateway open. Avienda's dark reddish head hopped through the neck of the shift and stared at him flatly. Not unfriendly, but not friendly either. Determined, though. What makes you think a man has the right to ask me that? Besides, to Elaine. After a moment, he managed to close his mouth. Avienda, we just... The two of us... we have to marry now. Not that I'm doing it because I have to, he added hastily. I want to. He was not sure of that at all, really. He thought he might love her, but he thought he might love Elaine, too. And for some reason, Min kept creeping in. You're as big a lecher as Matt. But for once, he could do what was right because it was right. She sniffed at him and felt her stockings to be sure they were dry, then sat down to don them. Egwene has spoken to me of your Two Rivers marriage customs. You want to wait a year? He asked incredulously. The year? Yes, that is what I meant. He had never realized before how much leg a woman showed pulling on a stocking. Odd that could seem so thrilling after he had seen her naked and sweating, and he concentrated on listening to her. Egwene said she thought of asking her mother's permission for you, but before she mentioned it, her mother told her she had to wait another year, even if she did have her hair in a braid. Avienda frowned, one knee almost under her chin. Is that right? She said a girl was not allowed to braid her hair until she was old enough to marry. Do you understand what I am saying? You look like that fish Moraine caught in the river. There were no fish in the waste. Aiel knew them only from books. Of course I do, he said. He might as well have been deaf and blind for all he understood. Shifting under the blankets, he made himself sound as sure as he could manage. At least... Well, the customs are complicated, and I am not certain which part you are talking about. She looked at him suspiciously for a moment, but Aiel customs were so intricate that she believed him. In the Two Rivers, you walked out for a year, and if you suited, then you became betrothed and finally married. That was as far as custom went. She went on as she dressed. I meant about a girl asking her mother's permission during the year, and the wisdoms. I cannot say I understand that. The white blouse going over her head muffled her words for a moment. If she wants him, and she is old enough to marry, why should she need permission? But you see, by my customs, her tone of voice said they were the only ones that mattered. It is my place to choose whether to ask you, and I will not. By your customs, fastening her belt, she shook her head dismissively, I did not have my mother's permission. And you would need your father's, I suppose, or your father-brother's, since your father is dead. We did not have them, so we cannot marry. She began folding the scarf to wrap around her forehead. I see, he said weakly. Any boy in the Two Rivers who asked his father for that kind of permission was asking to have his ears soundly boxed. When he thought of the lads who had sweated themselves silly, worrying that someone, anyone, would find out what they were doing with the girl they meant to marry. For that matter, he remembered when Nynaeve caught Kimry Lewin and Bar Doughtrey in Bar's father's hayloft. Kimry had had her hair braided for 5 years, but when Nynaeve was through with her, Mistress Lewin had taken over. The women's circle had nearly skinned poor Bar alive, and that was nothing to what they had done to Kimry over the month they thought was the shortest decent time to wait for a wedding. The joke, told quietly, where it would not get to the women's circle, had been that neither Bar nor Kimry had been able to sit down the whole first week they were married. Bran supposed Kimry had failed to ask permission. But I guess Egwene wouldn't know all the men's customs, after all, he continued. Women don't know everything. You see, since I started it, we have to marry. It doesn't matter about permissions." "You started it?" Her sniff was pointed and meaning. "Aiel, Andrin, or anything else, women use those noises like sticks to prod or thump. It does not matter anyway, since we are going by Aiel customs. This will not happen again, Randall Thor." He was surprised and pleased to hear regret in her voice. "You belong to the near sister of my near sister. I have told to Elaine now, but that is none of your concern. Are you going to lie there forever? I have heard that men turn lazy after, but it cannot be long until the clans are ready to begin the morning's march. You must be there." Suddenly, a stricken look crossed her face, and she sagged to her knees. "If we can return, I'm not certain that I remember what I did to make the hole, Randall Thor. You must find our way back." He told her how he had blocked her gateway and could still feel it holding. She looked relieved and even smiled at him. But it became increasingly clear as she folded her legs and arranged her skirts that she did not mean to turn her back while he dressed. "Fair's fair," he muttered after a long moment, and scrambled out of the blankets. He tried to be as nonchalant as she had been, but it was not easy. He could feel her eyes like a touch even when he turned away from her. She had no call to tell him he had a pretty behind. He had not said anything about how pretty hers was. She only said it to make him blush anyway. Women did not look at men that way. And they don't ask their mother's permission to. He had an idea that life with Avienda had not become one bit easier. Chapter 32, A Short Spear. There was little discussion. Even if the storm still raged outside, they could make it back to the gateway using the blankets and rugs for cloaks. Avienda began dividing them while he seized Saidin, filling himself with life and death, molten fire and liquid ice. "Split them equally," he told her. He knew his voice was cold and emotionless. Asmodean had said he could go beyond that, but he had not managed to so far. She gave him a surprised look, but all she said was, "There is more of you to cover," and went on as she was. There was no point in arguing. In his experience from Emmons Field to the Maidens, if a woman wanted to do something for you, the only way to stop her was to tie her up, especially if it involved sacrifice on her part. The surprise was that she had not sounded acid, had not said anything about him being a soft wetlander. Maybe something good besides a memory had come out of this. She can't really mean never again. He suspected that she meant exactly that, though. Weaving a finger-thin flow of fire, he sliced the outline of a door in one wall, widening the gap at the top. Startlingly, daylight shone through. Releasing Saidin, he exchanged surprised looks with Avienda. He knew he had lost track of time. He lost track of the year. But they could not have been inside that long. Wherever they were, it was a great distance from Kyrian. He pushed against the block, but it did not budge until he put his back into it, dug in his heels, and shoved with all of his might. Just as it occurred to him that he very probably could have done this more easily with the power, the block toppled outward, taking him with it into cold, crisp, pale daylight. Not all the way, though. It stopped at an angle, propped against snow that had built up around the hut. Lying on his back, with only a bit of his head sticking out, he could see other mounds, some smooth drifts around sparse, stunted trees that he did not recognize, others maybe burying bushes or boulders. He opened his mouth and forgot what he was going to say as something swept through the air not 50 feet above him. A leathery gray shape, far bigger than a horse, on slow-beating, widespread wings, a horny snout thrust out before, and clawed feet and thin, lizard-like tail trailing behind. His head twisted on its own to follow the thing's flight over the trees. There were two people on its back. Despite what seemed to be some sort of hooded garments, it was plain that they were scanning the ground below. If he had had more than his head showing, if he had not been directly under the creature, they would surely have seen him. "Leave the blankets," he said as he ducked back inside. He told her what he had seen. Maybe they'd be friendly and maybe not, but I'd as soon not find out. He was not sure he wanted to meet people who rode something like that in any case, if they were people. "We are going to sneak back to the gateway. As quickly as we can, but sneaking." For a wonder, she did not argue. When he commented on it, as he was helping her climb over the ice block, that was a wonder too. She accepted his hand without so much as a glare. She said, "I do not argue when you make sense, Randall Thor." That was hardly the way he remembered it. The land around them lay flat beneath its deep blanket of snow, but to the west, sharp white-tipped mountains rose, peaks wreathed in cloud. He had no difficulty knowing they lay west, for the sun was rising. Less than half its golden ball stuck above the ocean. He stared at that. The land slanted down enough for him to see waves crashing in violent spray on a rocky, boulder-strewn shore maybe half a mile away. An ocean to the east, stretching endlessly to the horizon and sun. If the snow had not been enough, that told him they were in no land he knew. Avienda stared at the rolling breakers and pounding waves in amazement, then frowned at him as it hit home. She might never have seen an ocean, but she had seen maps. In her skirts, the snow gave her even more trouble than it did him, and he floundered, digging his way through as much as walking, sometimes sinking to his waist. She gasped as he scooped her up in his arms, and her green eyes glared. "We have to move faster than you can dragging those skirts," he told her. The glare faded, but she did not put an arm around his neck as he had half hoped. Instead, she folded her hands and put on a patient face, a bit touched with sullenness. Whatever changes what they had done might have wrought in her, she was not completely different. He could not understand why that should be a relief. He could have melted a path through the snow as he had in the storm, but if another of those flying things came, that cleared path would lead straight to them. A fox trotted by across the snow well to his right, pure white except for a black tip to its bushy tail, occasionally eyeing him and Avienda warily. Rabbit tracks marred the snow in places, blurred where they had left, and once he saw the prints of a cat that had to be as large as a leopard. Maybe there were larger animals still. Maybe some flightless relative of that leathery creature. Not something he wanted to encounter, but there was always the chance the flyers might take the plowed furrow he was leaving now as the track of some animal. He still made his way from tree to tree, wishing there were more of them, and closer together. Of course, if there had been, he might not have found Avienda in the storm. She grunted, frowning up at him, and he loosened his hold on her again. But it would surely have helped now. It was because he was creeping in that way, though, that he saw the others first. Less than 50 paces away, between him and the gateway, right at the gateway, he could feel his weave holding it, were 4 people on horseback and more than 20 afoot. The mounted were all women shrouded in long, thick, fur-lined cloaks. 2 of them each wore a silvery bracelet on her left wrist, connected by a long leash of the same shining stuff to a bright collar tied around the neck of a gray-clad, cloakless woman standing in the snow. The others afoot were men in dark leather and armor painted green and gold, overlapping plates down their chests and the outsides of their arms and fronts of their thighs. Their spears bore green and gold tassels, their long shields were painted in the same colors, and their helmets seemed to be the heads of huge insects, faces peering out through the mandibles. One was clearly an officer, lacking spear or shield, but with a curved, 2-handed sword on his back. Silver outlined the plates of his lacquered armor, and thin green plumes, like feelers, heightened the illusion of his painted helmet. Rand knew where he and Avienda were now. He had seen armor like that before, and women collared like that. Setting her down behind something that looked a little like a wind-twisted pine, except that its trunk was smooth and gray, streaked with black, he pointed, and she nodded silently. "The two women on leashes can channel," he whispered. "Can you block them?" Hurriedly, he added, "Don't embrace the source yet. They're prisoners, but they still might warn the others. And even if they don't, the women with the bracelets might be able to feel them sense you." She looked at him oddly, but wasted no time on foolish questions, such as how he knew. They would come later, he knew. "The women with the bracelets can channel also," she replied, just as softly. "It feels very strange, though. Weak, as if they had never practiced it. I cannot see how that can be." Rand could. The Mani were the ones who were supposed to be able to channel. If two women had somehow slipped through the Shanshan net to become Suldam instead, and from the little he knew of them, that would not be easy, for the Shanshan tested every last woman during the years that she might first show signs of channeling. They would surely never dare to betray themselves. "Can you shield all four?" She gave him a very smug look. "Of course. Egwene taught me to handle several blows at once. I can block them, tie those off, and wrap them up in flows of air before they know what is happening." That self-satisfied little smile faded. "I am fast enough to handle them and their horses, but that leaves the rest to you, until I can bring help. If any get away, they can surely cast those spears this far, and if one of them pins you to the ground..." For a moment she muttered under her breath, as if angry that she could not complete a sentence. Finally she looked at him, her gaze as furious as he had ever seen it. "Egwene has told me of healing, but she knows little, and I less." What could she be angry about now? Better to try understanding the sun than a woman, he thought wryly. Tom Maryland had told him that, and it was simple truth. "You take care of shielding those women," he told her. "I will do the rest. Not until I touch your arm, though." He could tell she thought he was boasting, but he would not have to split blows, only weave one intricate flow of air that would bind arms to sides and hold horses' feet as well as human. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed hold of Saidin, touched her arm, and channeled. Shocked cries rose from the Shanshan. He should have thought of gags, too, but they could be through the gateway before they attracted anyone else. Holding onto the source, he seized Avienda's arm and half-dragged her through the snow, ignoring her snarls that she could walk. At least this way he broke a trail for her, and they had to hurry. The Shanshan quieted, staring as he and Avienda made their way around in front of them. The two women, who were not Suldam, had thrown back their hoods, struggling against his weave. He held it rather than tying. He would have to release it when he went away anyway, for the simple reason that he could not leave even Shanshan bound in the snow. If they did not freeze to death, there was always the big cat whose tracks he had seen. Where there was one, there must be more. The gateway was there all right, but instead of looking into his room in Ironrod, it was a gray blank. It seemed narrower than he remembered, too. Worse, he could see the weave of that grayness. It had been woven from Saidin. Furious thought slid across the void. He could not tell what it was meant to do, yet it could easily be a trap for whoever stepped through, woven by one of the male Forsaken. By Asmodean, most likely. If the man could hand him over to the others, he might be able to regain his place among them. Yet there could be no question of staying here. If Avienda only remembered how she had woven the gateway in the first place, she could open another, but as it was, they were going to have to use this, trap or no. One of the mounted women, a black raven in front of a stark tower on the gray breast of her cloak, had a severe face and dark eyes that seemed to want to drill into his skull. Another, younger and paler and shorter, yet more regal, wore a silver stag's head on her green cloak. The little fingers of her riding gloves were too long. Rand knew from the shaven sides of her scalp that those long fingers covered nails grown long and no doubt lacquered, both signs of Shanshan nobility. The soldiers were stiff-faced and stiff-backed, but the officer's blue eyes glittered behind the jaws of the insect-like helmet, and his gauntleted fingers writhed as he struggled futilely to reach his sword. Rand did not care very much about them, but he did not want to leave the Domani behind. At the least, he could give them a chance to escape. They might be staring at him as they would a wild animal with bared fangs, but they had not chosen to be prisoners, treated little better than domestic animals themselves. He put a hand to the collar of the nearest and felt a jolt that nearly numbed his arm. For an instant, the void shifted, and Saidin raged through him like the snowstorm 1,000-fold. The Damani's short yellow hair flailed as she convulsed at his touch, screaming, and the Suldam connected to her gasped, face going white. Both would have fallen, if not held by bonds of air. "You try it," he told Avienda, working his hand. "A woman must be able to touch the thing safely. I don't know how it unfastens." It looked of a piece, linked somehow, just like bracelet and leash. But it went on, so it must be able to come off. A few moments could not make any difference to whatever had happened to the gateway. Was it Osmodian? Avienda shook her head, but began fumbling at the other woman's collar. "Hold still," she growled as the Damani, a pale-faced girl of 16 or 17, tried to flinch back. If the leashed woman had looked on Rand as a wild beast, they stared at Avienda like a nightmare made flesh. "She is Marat Damani," the pale girl wailed. "Save Sari, mistress! Please, mistress, save Sari!" The other Damani, older, almost motherly, began weeping uncontrollably. Avienda glared at Rand as hard as she did the girl for some reason, muttering angrily under her breath as she worked at the collar. "It is he, Lady Morsa," the other Damani Suldam said suddenly in a soft drawl that Rand could barely understand. "I have borne the bracelet long, and I could tell if the Marat Damani had done more than block Ginny." Morsa did not look surprised. In fact, there seemed to be a light of horrified recognition in her blue eyes as she gazed at Rand. There was only one way that could be. "You were at Falma," he said. If he went through first, it meant leaving Avienda behind, although only for a moment. "I was." The noblewoman looked faint, but her slow, slurring voice was coolly imperious. "I saw you, and what you did." "Take care I don't do the same here. Give me no trouble, and I will leave you in peace." He could not send Avienda first, into the light knew what. If emotion had not been so distant, he would have grimaced the way she was grimacing over that collar. They had to go through together, and be ready to face anything. "Much has been kept secret about what happened in the lands of the great Hawkwing, Lady Morsa," the severe-faced woman said. Her dark eyes were as hard on Morsa as they were. "I that the ever-victorious army has tasted defeat. Do you seek truth in rumor, gentlemen?" Tone. "A seeker, above all, should know when to keep silent. The Empress herself has forbidden speech of the Karina until she calls it again. If you or I speak so much as the name of the city where that expedition landed, our tongues will be removed. Perhaps you would enjoy being tongueless in the Tower of Ravens? Not even the listeners would hear you scream for mercy or pay heed." Rand understood no more than 2 words in 3, and it was not the odd accents. He wished he had time to listen. Corina? Lorena? That was what the Shanshan and Falma had called their attempt to seize the lands beyond the Arith Ocean. The lands where he lived, that they considered their birthright. The rest, Seeker, listeners, the Tower of Ravens, were a mystery. But apparently the return had been called off, for the time being at least. That was worth knowing. The gateway was narrower. Maybe as much as a finger width narrower than moments before. Only his block held it open. It had tried to close as soon as Avienda released her weave, and it was still trying to. "Hurry," he told Avienda, and she gave him a look so patient it could as well have been a stone between his eyes. "I am trying, Randolph Thor," she said, still looking at the collar. Tears trickled down Sari's cheeks. A continuous low moan came from her throat, as if the Aiel woman intended to slit it. "You nearly killed the other two, and maybe yourself. Power rushing into both of them wildly when you touched the other collar. So leave it to me, and if I can do it, I will." Muttering a curse, she tried at the side. Bran thought about making the Suldam remove the collars. If anyone knew how the things came off, they would. But from the set frowns on their faces, he knew he would have to force them to it. If he could not kill a woman, he could not very well torture one. With a sigh, he glanced at the gray blankness filling the gateway again. The flows appeared to be woven into his. He could not slice one without the other. Passing through might trigger the trap, but cutting away the grayness, even if that act did not trip it, would allow the gateway to snap shut before they had a chance to leap through. It would have to be a blind jump into the light knew what. Morsa had listened carefully to every word he and Avienda said, and now she was gazing thoughtfully at the two Suldam. But Jallandin had never taken her eyes from the noblewoman's face. "Much has been kept secret that should not be held from the Seekers, Lady Morsa," the stern woman said. "The Seekers must know all." "You forget yourself, Jallandin," Morsa snapped, her gloved hands jerking. Had her arms not been bound to her sides, she would have sawed the reins. As it was, she tilted her head to stare down her nose at the other woman. "You were sent to me because Sarak looks above himself and has designs on Sarangadadai and Tual, not to ask of what the Empress has—" Jallandin broke in harshly. "It is you who forgets herself, Lady Morsa, if you think that you are proof against the Seekers for truth. I myself have put both a daughter and a son of the Empress, may the light bless her, to the question, and in gratitude for the confessions I wrenched from them, she allowed me to gaze upon her. Think you that your minor house stands higher than the Empress's own children?" Morsa remained upright, not that she had much choice, but her face went gray and she licked her lips. "The Empress, may the light illumine her forever, already knows far more than I can tell. I did not mean to imply—" The Seeker cut her off again, twisting her head to speak to the soldiers as if Morsa did not exist. "The woman Morsa is in the custody of the Seekers for truth. She will be put to the question as soon as we return to Merinlo. And the Suldam and Damani as well. It seems they too have hidden what they should not." Horror painted the faces of the named women, but Morsa could have stood for any of them. Eyes wide and suddenly haggard, she slumped as much as her invisible bonds would allow, voicing not a word of protest. She looked as if she had wanted to scream, yet she accepted. Jallandin's gaze turned to Rand. "She named you Randall Thor. You will be well treated if you surrender to me, Randall Thor. However you came here, you cannot think to escape, even if you kill us. There is a wide search for a Marath Damani who channeled in the night." Her eyes flickered to Avienda. "It will find you as well, inevitably, and you might be slain by accident. There is sedition in this district. I do not know how men like you are treated in your lands, but in Shanshan, your sufferings can be eased. Here, you can find great honor in the use of your power." He laughed at her, and she looked offended. "I cannot kill you, but I vow I should stripe your hide at least for that." He certainly would not have to worry about being gentled in Shanshan hands. In Shanshan, men who could channel were killed, not executed, hunted and shot down on sight. The gray-filled gateway was another finger narrower, barely wide enough now for both of them to pass through together. "Leave her, Avienda. We have to go now." She released Sari's collar and gave him an exasperated look, but her eyes went past him to the gateway, and she hoisted her skirts to stump through the snow to him, muttering to herself about frozen water. Be ready for anything, he told her, putting an arm around her shoulders. He told himself they had to be close together to fit, not because she felt good. I don't know what, but be ready. She nodded, and he said, Jump! Together they leaped into the grayness, Rand releasing the weave that had held the Shanshan in order to fill himself to bursting with Saidine, and landed, stumbling in his bedchamber in Ironrod, lamplit with darkness outside the windows. Asmodean sat against the wall beside the door with his legs crossed. He was not embracing the source, but Rand slammed a block between the man and Saidine anyway. Whirling with his arm still around Avienda, he found the gateway gone. No, not gone. He could still see his weaving, and what he knew must be Asmodean's, but there seemed to be nothing there at all. Without pause, he slashed his weave, and suddenly the gateway appeared. A rapidly narrowing view of Shanshan, the Lady Morsa slumped in her saddle, Jellandin shouting orders. A green and white tasseled spear lanced through the opening just before it snapped shut. Instinctively, Rand channeled air to snatch the suddenly wobbling 2-foot length of spear. The shaft ended as smoothly as any craftsman could have worked it. Shivering, he was glad that he had not tried removing the gray barrier, whatever it had been, before jumping through. A good thing neither of the Suldam recovered in time, he said, taking the severed spear in his hand. Or we'd have had worse than this coming after us. He watched Asmodean from the corner of his eye, but the man only sat there, looking slightly ill. He could not know whether Rand meant to stuff that spear down his throat. Avienda's sniff was her most pointed yet. Do you think I released them? She said heatedly. She removed his arm firmly, but he did not think her temper was for him. Or not for his arm, anyway. I tied their shields as tightly as I could. They are your enemies, Randall Thor. Even the ones you called Damani, our faithful dogs, would have killed you rather than be free. You must be hard with your enemies, not soft. She was right, he thought, hefting the spear. He had left enemies behind that he might well have to face one day. He had to become harder. Or else he would be ground to flour before he ever reached Shale Ghul. Abruptly, she began smoothing her skirts, and her voice became almost conversational. I noticed that you did not save that way-faced Morsa from her fate. From the way you looked at her, I thought big eyes and a round bosom had caught your eye. Rand stared at her in amazement that oozed across the emptiness surrounding him like syrup. She could have been saying the soup was ready. He wondered how he was supposed to have noticed Morsa's bosom, hidden as it was in a fur-lined cloak. I should have brought her, he said, to question her about the Shanshan. I will be troubled by them again, I am afraid. The glint that had appeared in her eye vanished. She opened her mouth, but stopped, glancing at Asmodean, when he raised a hand. He could all but see the questions about Shanshan piled up behind her eyes. If he knew her, once begun, she would not stop digging until she had uncovered scraps he did not even remember he knew. Which might not be a bad thing. Another time. After he had wrung a few answers out of Asmodean. She was right. He had to be hard. That was a smart thing you did, she said, hiding the hole I made. If a Guy Shine had come in here, 1,000 of the Spear Sisters might have marched through seeking you. Asmodean cleared his throat. One of the Guy Shine did come. Someone named Sulan had told her she must see you eat, my Lord Dragon. And to stop her from bringing the tray in here and finding you gone, I took the liberty of telling her that you and the young woman did not want to be disturbed. A slight tightening of his eyes caught Rand's attention. What? Just that she took it strangely. She laughed out loud and went running off. A few minutes later, there must have been 20 Fardarais Mai beneath the window, shouting and beating their spears and their bucklers for a good hour or more. I must say, my Lord Dragon, some of the suggestions they called up startled even me. Rand felt his cheeks burning. It had happened on the other side of the bloody world, and still the maidens knew. but Avienda only narrowed her eyes. Did she have hair and eyes like mine? She did not wait for Osmodian's nod. It must have been my first sister, Niella. She saw the startled question on Rand's face and answered it before he could speak. Niella is a weaver, not a maiden, and she was taken half a year ago by Charine maidens during a raid on Sulara Hold. She tried to talk me out of taking the spear, and she has always wanted me wed. I'm going to send her back to the Charine with a welt on her bottom for everyone she told. Rand caught her arm as she started to stalk out of the room. I want to talk with Nadeo. I don't suppose there is much time left until dawn. 2 hours, maybe, Osmodian put in. So there will be little sleeping now. If you want to try, would you mind making your bed elsewhere for what's left of the night? You need new blankets anyway. She nodded curtly before pulling loose and slammed the door behind her. Surely she was not angry at being tossed out of his bedchamber. How could she be? She had said nothing more would happen between them. But he was glad he was not Niella. Bouncing the shortened spear in his hand, he turned to Osmodian. A strange scepter, my Lord Dragon. It will do for one. To remind him that the Shonchan was still out there. For once he wished his voice was even colder than the void and Sayadine made it. He had to be hard. Before I decide whether to skewer you with it like a lamb, why did you never mention this trick of making something invisible? If I hadn't been able to see the flows, I'd never have known the gateway was still there. Osmodian swallowed, shifting as though he did not know whether Rand meant his threat. Rand was not sure himself. My Lord Dragon, you never asked. A matter of bending light. You always have so many questions, it is hard to find a moment to speak of anything else. You must realize by now that I have thrown my lot in with yours completely. Licking his lips, he got up, as far as his knees, and began to babble. I felt your weave. Anybody within a mile could have felt it. I never saw anything like it. I didn't know that anyone but Demandred could block a gateway that was closing, and maybe Cimarag, and Lutheran. I felt it, and came, and a hard time I had getting past those maidens. I used the same trick. You must know I am your man now. My Lord Dragon, I am your man. It was the repetition of what the Karianan had said that got through as much as anything else. Gesturing with the half-spear, he said roughly, Stand. You are a dog. But as Osmodian slowly rose, he laid the long spear point alongside the man's throat. He had to be hard. From now on, you will tell me 2 things I don't ask about every time we talk. Every time, mind. If I think you are trying to hide anything from me, you will be glad to let Cimarag have you. As you say, my Lord Dragon, Osmodian stammered. He looked ready to bow and kiss Rand's hand. To avoid the chance, Rand moved to the blanketless bed and sat on the linen sheet, the feather mattresses yielding under him as he studied the spear. A good idea to keep it for remembrance, if not as a scepter. Even with everything else, he had best not forget the Shonchan. Those Damani. If Avienda had not been there to block them from the source. You have tried showing me how to shield a woman and failed. Try showing me how to avoid blows I cannot see, how to counter them. Once Lanfear had sliced his weavings as neatly as with a knife. Not easy, my Lord Dragon, without a woman to practice against. We have 2 hours, Rand said coldly, letting the man's shield unravel. Try. Try very hard.
Chapter 33. A Question of Crimson. The knife brushed Nynaeve's hair as it thunked into the board she was leaning against, and she flinched behind her blindfold. She wished she had a decent braid instead of locks hanging loose about her shoulders. If that blade had cut even 1 strand... Fool woman, she thought bitterly. Fool, fool woman. With the scarf folded over her eyes, she could just see a narrow line of light at the bottom. It seemed bright from the darkness behind the thick folds. There had to be enough light yet, even if it was late afternoon. Surely the man would not throw when he could not see properly. The next blade struck on the other side of her head. She could feel it vibrating. She thought it almost touched her ear. She was going to kill Tom Marilyn and Valen Luca, and maybe any other man she could get her hands on sheer principle. "The pears!" Luca shouted, as if he were not just 30 paces from her. He must think the blindfold made her deaf as well as blind. Fumbling in the pouch at her belt, she brought out a pear and carefully balanced it atop her head. She was blind, a pure blind fool. 2 more pears, and she gingerly extended her arms to either side between the knives that outlined her, holding one in either hand by the stems. There was a pause. She opened her mouth to tell Tom Marilyn that if he so much as nicked her, she would chunk, chunk, chunk. The blades came so fast, she would have yelped if her throat had not contracted like a fist. She held only the stem in her left hand. The other pear trembled faintly with the knife through it, and the pear on her head leaked juice into her hair. Snatching the scarf off, she stalked toward Tom and Luca, both of them grinning like maniacs. Before she could speak one of the words boiling up in her, Luca said admiringly, "You are magnificent, Nana. Your bravery is magnificent, but you are more so." He swirled that ridiculous red silk cloak in a bow, one hand over his heart. "I shall call this Rose Among Thorns, though truly you are more beautiful than any mere rose." "It doesn't take much bravery to stand like a stump." A rose, was she? She would show him thorns. She would show both of them. "You listen to me, Valen Luca. Such courage. You never even flinch. I tell you, I would not have the stomach to do what you are doing." That was the simple truth, she told herself. "I am no braver than I have to be," she said in a milder tone. It was hard to shout at a man who insisted on telling you how brave you were. Certainly better to hear than all that blather about roses. Tom knuckled his long white mustaches as if he saw something funny. "The dress," Luca said, showing all of his teeth in a smile. "You will look wonderful in—" "No!" she snapped. Whatever he had gained, he had just lost by bringing this up again. Clarine had made the dress Luca wanted her to wear, in silk more crimson than his cloak. It was her opinion that the color was to hide blood if Tom's hand slipped. But Nana, beauty in danger is a great draw, Luca's voice crooned, as if whispering sweetness in her ear. You will have every eye on you, every heart pounding for your beauty and courage. If you like it so much, she said firmly, you wear it. Aside from the color, she was not about to show that much bosom in public, whether or not Clarine thought it was proper. She had seen Lattel's performing dress, all black spangles with a high neck to her chin. She could wear something like... What was she thinking? She had no intention of actually going through with this. She'd only agreed to this practice to stop Luca scratching at the wagon door every night to try convincing her. The man was nothing if not deft at knowing when to change the subject. What happened here? He asked, suddenly all smooth solicitude. She flinched as he touched her puffy eye. It was his bad luck to choose that. He would have done better to continue trying to stuff her into that red dress. I did not like the way it looked at me in the mirror this morning, so I bit it. Her flat tone and bared teeth made Luca snatch his hand back. From the wary gleam in his dark eyes, he suspected she might bite again. Tom was stroking his mustaches furiously, red in the face from the effort of not laughing. He knew what had happened, of course. He would. And as soon as she left, he would no doubt regale Luca with his version of events. Men could not avoid gossiping. It was in them at birth, and nothing women could do ever got it out of them. The daylight was dimmer than she had thought. The sun sat red on the treetops to the west. If you ever try this again without better light, she growled, shaking a fist at Tom. It's almost dusk. I suppose, the man said, bushy eyebrow lifting. This means you want to leave out the bit where I am blindfolded? He was joking, of course. He had to be joking. As you wish, Nana. From now on, only in the most perfect light. It was not until she stalked away, swishing her skirts angrily, that she realized that she had agreed to actually do this fool thing, by implication at least. They would try to hold her to it as surely as the sun would set tonight. Fool, fool, fool woman. The clearing where they, or Tom at least, burn him and Luca both, had been practicing stood some little distance from the camp over beside the road north. Doubtless Luca had not wanted to upset the animals should Tom put one of his knives through her heart. The man would likely have fed her corpse to the lions. The only reason he wanted her to wear that dress was so he could ogle what she had no intention of showing to anyone but Lan, and burn him too for a stubborn fool man. She wished she had him there so she could tell him so. She wished she had him there so she could be sure he was safe. She broke a dead dog fennel and used its feathery brown length like a whip to snap the heads off weeds that poked through the leaves on the ground. Last night, Elaine had said, Egwene reported fighting in Cairhien, skirmishes with brigands, and Cairhienin who saw any Aiel as an enemy, with Andoran soldiers trying to claim the Sun Throne for Morgaze. Lan had been involved in them. Whenever Moiraine let him out of her sight, he apparently managed to take himself to the fighting, as if he could sense where it would be. Nynaeve had never thought that she would want the Aes Sedai to keep Lan on a short leash at her side. This morning, Elaine had still been disturbed about her mother's soldiers being in Cairhien fighting Rand's Aiel, but what worried Nynaeve was the brigands. According to Egwene, if anyone could identify stolen property in a brigand's possession, if anyone could swear to seeing him kill anyone or burn so much as a shed, Rand was hanging him. He did not put his hands on the rope, but it was the same thing, and Egwene said he watched every execution with a face cold and hard as the mountains. That was not like him. He had been a gentle boy. Whatever had happened to him in the waste had been very much for the worse. Well, Rand was far away, and her own problems, hers and Elaine's, were no nearer solution. The river Eldar lay less than a mile north, spanned by a single lofty stone bridge built between tall metal pillars that glistened without a speck of rust. Remnants of an earlier time, certainly, perhaps even an earlier age. She'd gone up to it at midday, right after they arrived, but there had not been a boat in the river worthy of the name. Rowboats, small fishing boats working along the reed-lined banks, some strange, narrow little things that skittered over the water propelled by kneeling men with paddles, even a squat barge that looked to be moored in mud. There seemed to be a lot of mud showing on both sides, some of it dried hard and cracked, yet that was no wonder with the heat holding on so unseasonably, but nothing that could carry them swiftly away downriver as she wanted. Not that she knew where it was to take them yet. Rack her brains as she would, she could not remember the name of the town where the Blue Sisters were supposed to be. She swiped savagely at a scatterhead, and it burst in little white feathers that floated to the ground. They probably were not there anymore in any case, if they ever had been, but it was the only clue they had to a safe place short of Tyr, if she could only remember it. The only good thing on the entire journey north was that Elaine had stopped flirting with Tom. There had not been an incident since joining the show. At least it would have been good if Elaine had not apparently decided to pretend nothing had ever happened. Yesterday, Nynaeve had congratulated the girl on coming to her senses, and Elaine had coolly replied, "Are you trying to find out if I will stand in your way with Tom, Nynaeve? He's rather old for you, and I did think you had planted your affections elsewhere, but you are old enough to make your own decisions. I am fond of Tom, as I think he is of me. I look on him like a second father. If you want to flirt with him, you have my permission, but I really did think you were more constant." Luca meant to cross the river in the morning, and Samara, the town on the other side in Gildan, was no fit place to be. Luca had spent most of the day since their arrival over in Samara, securing a place to set up his show. He was only concerned that a number of other menageries had beaten him there, and he was not the only one to have more than animals. That was why he had grown particularly insistent about her letting Tom throw knives at her. She was lucky he did not want it done high-walking with Elaine. The man seemed to think the most important thing in the world was that his show should be bigger and better than any other. For herself, the worrisome thing was that the Prophet was in Samara, his followers crowding the town and spilling out into tents, huts, and shanties around it, a city that overwhelmed Samara's own not inconsiderable size. It had a high stone wall, and most of the buildings were stone as well, many as much as 3 stories, and there were more roofs of slate or tile than thatch. This side of the Eldar was no better. They had passed 3 White Cloak encampments before reaching their stopping place, hundreds of white tents in neat rows, and there had to be more they had not seen. White Cloaks on this side of the river, the Prophet, and maybe a riot waiting to happen on the other, and she had no idea where to go and no way to get there except in a lumbering wagon that moved no faster than she could walk. She wished she had never let Elaine talk her into abandoning the coach. Not seeing a weed close enough to snap without stepping aside, she broke the dog fennel in half, then again, until the pieces were no longer than her hands, and tossed them to the ground. She wished she could do the same with Luca, and Galad Damadred for sending them running here, and Aulan Mandragoran for not being here. Not that she needed him, of course, but his presence would have been a comfort. The camp was quiet, with evening meals cooking over small fires beside the wagons. Petra was feeding the black-maned lion, thrusting huge pieces of meat through the bars on a stick. The female lions were already hunkered down over theirs companionably, letting out an occasional growl if someone came too close to their cage. Nynaeve stopped near Aludra's wagon. The illuminator was working with wooden mortar and pestle on a table let down from the side of her wagon, muttering to herself over what she was compounding. 3 of the Chavanas smiled at Nynaeve enticingly, motioning her to join them. Not Brugh, who still glowered over his lip, though she had given him a salve to make the swelling go down. Maybe if she hit the rest of them as hard, they would listen to Luca, and more importantly to her, and realize that she did not want their smiles. Too bad Master Valen Luca could not follow his own instructions. Latelle turned from the bear cage and gave her a tight smile, more of a smirk, really. Mainly, though, Nynaeve stared at Sarandin, who was filing the blunt toenails of one of the huge gray Sredit with what looked like a tool suitable for metal.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call end to this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.